ora! Hello from sunny Christchurch. I'm going to read to you today from my new book, What's Irish for Encore. It comes out in like 2 days, so grab that as soon as it comes out. In the meantime, the first book in this series, What's French for Oops, is actually free, just for a few days, so you should definitely get on that. It's only available on Amazon, but it is free, so enjoy. And then there's What's Dutch for Damn, which is already out and available on all the ebook platforms. And number 3, What's Irish for Encore, comes out on the 14th of January in America. So it's sort of about a day later here in New Zealand. Comes out at the same moment, just to be clear, but it'll be the 15th here by then because we're just, a whole day ahead. Alright, so, sorry, I'm a little bit sun-fried, I think. Been camping, too much sun, reading lots, which is nice. On the topic of reading, let's go. Alright, chapter 1. Ciaran Michaels was definitely being punished. He just wasn't sure of his crime, sticking to his principles or not sticking to his principles. On a daily basis at the moment he seemed to do both. You want to take children to see this play? Mrs. Keegan often wanted a chat when she came to pick up her son from youth group. It was not a highlight of Ciaran's week. Many of them haven't ever been to see a play, he said. It's a wonderful opportunity. It's immoral. We'll have a robust discussion about the morality after we see it. She gave an unhappy sigh. Come along, Asher. Ciaran had got off rather lightly this week. Or perhaps Mrs. Keegan intended to discuss the matter with the head of the parish, Father Lawrence. Wouldn't be the first time. Peter waved from the far side of the basketball court. His son was probably still inside, finishing off the hot chocolate. Evening, Ciaran walked over. How are you, Father? Oh, slightly winded. He nodded toward the fierce 3-on-3 game that thankfully didn't require him anymore. I just saw Mrs. Keegan leaving. Ciaran nodded. Sure it was the basketball that winded you? Biting back a smile, Ciaran gestured toward the hall, and they walked that way together. How much trouble am I asking for, taking them to this play? Oh, a whole world of it, but top choice, it's a great play. I'm already on probation. Exactly. What have you got to lose? Ciaran laughed, but there was plenty to lose. If the church wanted to show him who was boss, they'd find a way. He could lose St. Thomas's. They'd send him to God knows where. Indeed, God probably did know. Is that what this sinking feeling is, God? A warning? Peter's son, James, was leaning over the pool table, taking a highly unlikely shot. Good Lord, Father, are you teaching them anything? Peter shook his head. James missed. Can I finish the game, Dad? Suppose I should make myself comfortable. Fancy a hot chocolate? Ciaran noticed the status of the servery, a spray of chocolate powder, spilled milk in dirty cups. How about a hot? Peter winked. Chocolate, wink wink. Sorry, I'm fresh out of Winky. Ciaran made them both a cup of tea. He'd clean up later, once everyone had gone home. I can't watch. Peter took his tea and turned away from the pool table. Back outside, it was a gorgeous evening. Peter sat on the bench nearest the door, where the smokers used to sit before they got marching orders to step off site. I had a letter, Peter said. Ominous. Indeed, your man saw my picture in the paper. At the march, Ciaran held tight to the warm comfort of his teacup. The repeal had passed, but done was not done, according to many Catholics. Aye, the basketball rolled toward them, and Peter reached out a foot to halt its progress. He nudged it back towards Michaela, a 17-year-old whose mam must be feeding her magic beans. She was growing like a beanstalk. Thanks. You and Connor need a lift home? Peter offered. If it's okay. She turned to her brother, who was playing on the opposing team. We got a lift. They went back to their game. I'm to expect a visit. Peter lifted his tea as if in a toast. I'll talk to him. Ciaran regretted the offer before he'd even finished making it. The parish priest was a practical sort of man. When it came down to it, he didn't feel strongly about what anyone did in the privacy of their own homes, but he didn't like a scandal. Has he forgiven you for marching with us in May? The marriage equality referendum had passed, and Ciaran couldn't regret standing up for what he believed, even if he was still paying the price 6 months later. A priest, collar and all, standing shoulder to shoulder with protesters, carrying a rainbow flag, was a strong visual anywhere, but especially in Ireland. Had his parish priest forgiven him? Hard to say. I'll take that as a no, said Peter. He has no business reprimanding you. Tell him I gave you a sound dressing down if you like. Peter laughed. I doubt he'd believe it. Are you questioning my ability to keep my parishioners in line? I'm questioning your opposition to the Eighth Gam. There was only one repeal anyone meant in Ireland these days. The Eighth Amendment. Yeah, well, I've been a coward on that score. It wasn't something Ciaran was proud of, truth be told. But it was necessary. Speaking up for gay rights was one thing. Demanding legal access to abortion, a whole nother kettle of fish. He'd lose his church. He'd lose everything. Any good he might be able to do, any progress he might hope to make in the community would be forfeit if he wasn't here to do the work. Another priest would slot into his role here, and the damage a conservative collar could do. Ciaran had known many of these kids all their lives. He could make a difference here. Well, that's what he kept telling himself whenever he felt disillusioned or frustrated or ever so slightly like a fish out of water. Ridiculous, given he'd spent almost his whole life here. He'd been baptised in this very church, and he'd gone to school but a short walk away, where most of these kids attended now. College not much further afield than that. Even those things, or people who had drawn him away from here, had seemed to, in the end, become reasons he returned. Adele and Gabe and Janine and Anne Reynolds. I'd hazard a guess. Peter stood up to catch an errant shot bouncing toward them. That your man knows what you really think. He threw the ball back to Michaela. I doubt it. Michaela took a long shot. The basketball sailed across the court and rebounded off the backboard. Ciaran had liked that part of mathematics at school. If the ball struck a plane at any given angle, one could calculate the trajectory. Predictable. Logical. What Peter was talking about? Less so. Plenty of priests would marry their gay parishioners at the drop of a hat. Plenty of priests are gay. Aye, but it's a much shorter list, the other thing. Peter sighed. Ciaran knew the man's history. He'd lost his wife in childbirth, and the baby too. After James, they'd known a second pregnancy would be risky. It wasn't planned, but a termination was a criminal offence, and they couldn't afford the trip to England. So the pregnancy was allowed to progress, and Peter lost almost everything. The question of abortion wasn't even a question for Peter. I won! James leapt down the 4 steps from the youth hall to the pavement. Incredible, Peter grinned, clapping his son on the shoulder. We could get pizza to celebrate. Didn't I already feed you today? Night, Father. We're off, Michaela. Geez, nice shot. Bye, Father. James trod off with his dad, nagging for one fast food option after another. The last of the basketballers always walked or bussed home on their own. Now that numbers had depleted, they bailed. Ciaran found the other pool player, Tina Fitzgerald, wiping up the hot chocolate spills. You're a godsend. Ciaran went through to the kitchen side of the servery and put everything away. Thank you. How are you getting home? Mum said she'd come. Ah, I can wait out on the road. Ciaran pulled his phone from his pocket and called Peter. Don't suppose you can swing back for the angel I just found cleaning up the hot chocolate apocalypse? Mum might be on her way. Tina stopped wiping, but they both knew her mum wasn't likely coming. The kitchen was spotless before Peter drove up, and Ciaran was left alone with nothing but a few chairs to stack against the walls and a pool cue to put back under the table. It was a gammy, well-marked pool table, but the kids didn't mind that. Anyone half-decent at the game would object to the state of the green, but even a mediocre talent would be devastating to the lot of them. They were universally terrible. Ciaran joined in occasionally. Maybe it was just his overdeveloped sense of guilt, but he always felt bad for beating them. His conscience wouldn't let him give the game away. Best not join in. Egging them on from the sidelines, that he could do. He turned off the lights and locked the external doors. The church was quiet. 6 candles to blow out, 2 more doors to latch. He couldn't help worrying about Peter, worrying that the parish priest would frighten the man away from the church entirely. Being a priest could be a lonely business. Ciaran was used to that, but Peter was a true friend. Not that they would stop being friends if Peter didn't attend services anymore, but there was something hopeful about a progressive like Peter remaining part of a church he didn't entirely agree with. Made Ciaran feel less alone. Anne Reynolds was, once again, in an airport. She'd only been in London for 3 months, but here she was, on her way. Not alone this time, that was new. She was travelling with Kate. In truth, it felt more momentous than it was. They'd be in Dublin for less than a month, for the theatre festival, then back to the Globe again, home, or something like it. Kate was saying goodbye to her boyfriend. Anne wandered toward the magazine rack at the nearest shop. Glancing back, she caught Kate's eye and cocked her head toward the store, a silent, "I'll be over here, take your time." Poor Johannes. He had moved countries to be with his girlfriend, and next minute she's off to Ireland. Taking Tempest to Dublin was too good an opportunity to pass up, but Kate was clearly still feeling a tad guilty. Guilt which might be somewhat abated by a lengthy and affectionate farewell in the departures hall at Heathrow. Anne flicked through Vanity Fair. It seemed a lifetime ago that she'd been interviewed for that feature. Was the peak of Anne's career behind her? Was she, in fact, fine with that? She had chosen to leave LA, to reinvent herself. About one thing, she was entirely sure. She had done the right thing, ending it with Brian. Still, she half expected to see her married colleague jump out of the magazine at her. That'd be the guilt. She'd done the right thing, in the end, for what it was worth. "Anyone you know?" Kate asked, sidling up. Anne flicked to the end of the magazine. "Not a one. Thought you were famous. Gee." Kate couldn't keep a straight face. "Thanks for letting us be mushy and pathetic." "It's not pathetic," Anne put the magazine back in the rack. "It's sweet. Are we due to board?" Anne pulled out their boarding passes. "We should probably find our gate." "Such a short flight. I keep thinking I'm looking at the wrong time." Kate peered at the departures board. "We want A21. This way," Anne pointed, and they started walking. "Weird how I've never been to Ireland. It's so close," Kate said. "It's more like New Zealand than England is in a lot of ways." "When were you last there?" "In Ireland? Oh, I've only been once. It was on a student exchange." Anne did the math in her head. "Shit, that was 20 years ago." "Everything I know about Ireland I learned from Marion Key's novel," Kate confessed. "That's probably more up-to-date information." "But good memories?" Kate asked with some confidence. Was it that obvious in Anne's tone of voice? They were good memories, most of them. "Any yummy Irish boys?" Kate nudged her elbow into Anne's arm. Anne laughed. "How did you know?" "Are you blushing?" Kate was just being melodramatic, which, as an actor, she was well within her rights to be. Anne was definitely not blushing. "He was the one who got me into acting." "Wait, seriously?" "Seriously. I have to hear this." Anne glanced at the map as they passed it. This wasn't right. "Shit, we're in the wrong terminal." Ciaran could hear the television from the kitchen. He poured the boiling water over the miserable soup sachet. Not that it said miserable soup on the packet, but nonetheless it was a fairly miserable meal. The offbeat theme tune played. Was it sad that a TV show was a genuine highlight of his week? Sad or not, there was no denying the fact. The week hadn't even been a bad one. Offbeat was just genuinely excellent television. And Anne Reynolds was in it. Stirring his soup, he looked out the kitchen window across the courtyard. He could see silhouettes of pedestrians passing the church. Please God, let them keep walking. The toast popped. Ciaran jumped out of his skin, and the soup leapt out of the mug, slopping across the bench and scalding his hand. Fuck. Deep breath. Okay, maybe he had deserved that. If someone walked up to a priest's house at this hour, their need was undoubtedly greater than his penchant to catch the episode of Offbeat. His penchant to catch this episode of Offbeat. But the courtyard was empty. His evening was his own. Toast soldiers and a little less soup than intended, and LA detectives getting themselves in and out of scrapes. Thank you, Lord. When he sat down at last, Anne Reynolds was under a desk hiding. She had a muddy shovel in one hand and a spinning plastic pinwheel in the other. Off-screen, a deep, nasal voice barked. "The Matheson Cemetery just called. Someone's messed with the Alvarez grave." Anne looked at the muddy shovel and grimaced. No, it wasn't Anne, it was her character, Detective Carla Harris. But it was Anne's dark blonde hair and sharp grey eyes and round chin and square shoulders. It was Anne's strange accent, remnants of a childhood in the Antipodes, never entirely overpowered by years in America. And perhaps he imagined it, but he could hear a little Irish in there. 4 months when she was 17, bashing about Dublin at his side, living in the spare room of his family's flat, just through a thin wall from his bed. 17. Geez, that was young to cross the globe for a student exchange. Live with total strangers. Not that they'd been strangers for long. They'd clicked on day one. with a ferocity he hadn't known then was so rare. Was it just wishful thinking that he, had made a lasting impression, that she'd picked up just enough of his accent and kept a remnant even 20 years later? Anne, Carla, waited for her grumpy boss to give up and leave, then let out a sigh, blowing the rainbow pinwheel into a frenzy. Carla wasn't really like Anne at all. Not that he knew what Anne was like anymore. But for one thing, Carla Harris was gay, and Ciaran was fairly sure Anne was not. She'd been an enthusiastic participant in their brief romance, 20 years ago if it was a day, but his memory was too sharp for his own good. He couldn't even let himself call it a romance, really. They'd been good friends, close, and he'd definitely fallen for her. But nothing had happened between them until just days before she left the country. And as soon as something did happen, something that wasn't acting their parts in Twelfth Night or pretending to, because if it was a choice between kissing in character and not kissing her, it was no choice at all. But as soon as it was real and honest, as soon as he'd kissed her and she'd kissed him back, and neither one of them had stopped for breath until it was over, as soon as all that, it was over. Whatever it had been brilliant. But he'd been young, stupid, terrified. He'd panicked afterwards, frozen her out. And then she'd left, disappeared back to New Zealand, got really good at acting, reappeared on his television, kicking ass and kissing girls, right here in his living room. Can you feel the tension? So that's the end of chapter 1. I will maybe post chapter 2 after the book's out. But hopefully that's enough of a teaser that you click pre-order. Alright, thank you. See ya!